ladies and gentlemen. Welcome again. Ladies, let's wait for the ladies to sit. Welcome again to the last speaker of today for this term. It's Adam Teeter. He's the co-founder and CEO of Vinepair, the most read publication about wine, spirits, beer in the US. And Adam has actually quite an amazing biography, which is long to read. He's not only perfect preparations, you know. He's not only writing about wine, he's also teaching journalism at the university. And he used to work for the Tablet magazine. And also, you're the winner of the Left Bank Bordeaux Cup American Wine Tasting Championship. And he's today here to talk about the changing millennial media landscape. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Cool, so hi everybody. Thanks for sticking with me till the end of the day. I appreciate it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happening in the United States when it comes to media, how things are changing, and how brands are starting to reach new consumers and old consumers. Because as Giles said, there's really, if you were in the last session, I think no true millennials at this point. There are obviously millennials, people with a millennial mindset. And if you weren't depressed by Steve's presentation and still want to come to the United States, then this would be the things you need to know about what's happening in the world of media, advertising, etc. Cool. So first a little bit about Vinepair. So we are America's now go-to drinks publication. We started 5 years ago and are now the largest and most read publication in the United States. And we are that way because we've changed the way that people write about wine, beer, and cocktails. So we use a voice that's very accessible. We look at culture, experiences, politics, etc., through the lens of the glass. So no more is it just about publishing articles that look at soil composition of wineries, very boring things to most people. So it looks at how you experience your life and how you bring wine, beer, spirits, etc. into your life experiences. So as we say at Vinepair, we celebrate the experiences you have and the connections you make with a glass in hand. That's what's really important to this next generation when they think about the wines they identify with and want to buy. So we're a multi-dimensional media property. We're headquartered in New York City. We obviously have a website, as every new media property does, but we also have a successful podcast. We have a print magazine, which I know is very crazy for a new media business, but we do. We hold events all over the country. We have a mobile site. We have wine and beer reviews, which we do just like other publications, though our reviews are very different. We do not score on a 100-point scale. We score on a very different scale, and we do not score blind. And we also have trips. So we run trips around the world. We have readers who will come with us to wine regions, beer regions, etc., and travel with writers, contributors, and experience a wine region or a beer region in an in-depth way, which is very unique and proves what we're saying, which is that this reader wants to really have access and experience things in a very different way than their parents did. So we have unparalleled reach. We reach 31.4 million monthly wine, beer, and spirits enthusiasts in the United States. So that looks very different than the rest of our competitors, and the reason that we're able to do this is because we're digital first, and because we take a very different approach to reaching this audience. So the way that sort of our traffic breaks down, or where our readers lie, are in a bunch of different buckets. We always have people that read on Vinepair.com. We also have people that read us only on Facebook. We have people that are, consuming our content on Pinterest. We have people that are consuming our content on Instagram or Twitter or email, or this thing that you're probably not familiar with in Romania, because it's really only in English-speaking countries right now, which is Apple News, which is a platform that sits inside the iPhone in which you read news or articles inside Apple. And we're actually Apple's preferred publisher in the wine, beer, and spirit space. So they highlight our content. And if you're in English-speaking countries of the United States, Canada, Great Britain, Australia, you would find our content there. So the biggest thing to understand about this new audience is that they're young, curious, and really thirsty for experiences, right? So they're looking for ways to connect with the product that's more than just, oh, someone told me this was good. Right? They want to know the story, as we've all been talking about today. They want to know the story behind the product, and they want the product to help identify or say something about themselves to their friends, right? Which is why the label matters, which is why where they bought it from matters, which is why the grapes inside of it matter. All these things are things that they use as a signal to their friends about who they are and what they stand for. So what that also means is that the way that the next generation is engaging with content has fundamentally changed, right? They want stories now that cause them to feel connected to products. So they don't simply want you to say to them, hey, I sent this wine to the Wine Spectator or Robert Parker and I got a 95, you should buy it. They don't care. Score might help validate them a little bit, but what they really care about is the story behind the product, right? Who makes it? Why do you make it? Why in this specific place? Especially for our reader, are you organic or biodynamic? Very much matters, right? Are you taking care of the planet, right? When would I consume this beverage? So is this a wine that's really good for a weeknight when I'm at home with my friend, with my significant other, and maybe we're eating takeout? Is this a wine that I can drink and watch Netflix? Is this a wine that I can bring to a house party or a dinner party? Or is this the wine that I buy and give to my boss when I'd like a raise or a promotion? Those are things that this consumer is asking all the time when they think about buying wine. And they make those choices based on those occasions. The score doesn't matter as much. What they really care about is how they use it and what it costs. So there are really 4 buckets, we say, that are really influencing this generation. And they all are connected, right? So the first are friends, and friends get their information from media and then tell each other. And that social media, that go back to friends and media because media is pushing into social media, and wine shops. We see wine shops actually in the United States among our readership as being much more influential than the Somme. Because wine shops are the place that, especially if you live in a community in which you have independent wine shops, people are shopping at quite regularly in order to discover new wines. And you have lots of journalists now who are pushing the wine shop as the place to go to discover, right? That could be online, that could be a wine shop as in a wine.com, but it's the place you actually go and you can purchase wine. Because the problem with what we see happening in the realm of the Somme is that a lot of the wines that Somms pour at restaurants in the United States, you can only get at those restaurants. So they're on premise, as we would say. And so you might make a connection with that with that consumer in the restaurant, but then they can't get the wine down the road, right? Which doesn't help you and which frustrates them. So they're looking for wines they can purchase and bring home that they can take to friends. And these are the 4 buckets that are really influencing those purchases. So we're going to concentrate on media because that's what we are. And we believe that media influences these other 3. So millennials rely heavily on web and mobile platforms to explore the world of wine, right? We're a mobile-first generation. We have the most powerful computer in our pockets, and that's how we're consuming everything and learning about things, right? And we see this as proof when we look at the data of our site. So for Vinepair, we see that our traffic spikes on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday nights when someone is looking at their phone at a wine shop and trying to make a purchase, right? So in terms of digital versus print, right, or traditional media, you would say, 81% of all millennials say they prefer reading digitally, right? Because it's here, right? I think about it when I'm getting ready to take a trip, like here for say. When my parents would go on trips, my dad would go out and buy a ton of different magazines and make sure they had everything they needed. I just go on my phone, I save some articles, I travel really light, I open the phone and I read everything on the plane as I'm traveling, right? I get on the subway, I have articles queued up, I'm ready to go, and I can consume more media than I could have consumed had I just been a slave to print publications, right? And that's why millennials prefer it so much. I also can call it up immediately, right? So I'm at a restaurant, I remember reading an article about a certain wine. I totally forgot to bring that copy of Wine Spectator I saw in the doctor's office, and so instead, I can queue it up on my phone and immediately read what I wanted to read before I make a purchase decision. And on top of this, we know 80% of millennials in the United States are getting their food and drink content digitally. Right? So this is where they're going as the source of all their information. So why is there a shift? Right? Because of what I said. It's super efficient. Right? In this day and age, it's much more efficient to be getting your news on your phone or even on your tablet than it would be to be subscribing to tons of different magazines. Right? So you can have real-time interaction. You can react to a story, post it on Facebook, put it on Twitter, even post it on Pinterest if it's a great cocktail recipe, etc. You can also have conversations with the writers and things like that. You can get direct customer feedback if you're an advertiser who's advertising digitally, right? So you know immediately whether or not someone's connecting with your messaging. So as a platform, as Vinepair, we're very digitally optimized. So we look at data all day long to decide what articles are performing, why, and make adjustments. Right? And we do that as well with advertisers that we work with. So what's the messaging that this wine brand or beer brand is using to try to reach our customer? Is it working or not? And let's run tests to see what could work if it's not working, right? So a brand might come to us and say, hey, I really think that we should go out with this message that we're a 5th generation winery. And so we start running an ad and we see, look, that's not working because that's not a unique message. But we may have uncovered, just like Giles did with design, a better story they should be telling, and we can run 2 tests to prove to that winery or that brewery that this story was more important than the one that they've been using for decades, right? And gets them more interaction and more brand awareness than they've had before. What's also great about digital is you can geo-target. So we think about the United States as Steve said, 50 different countries, right? And we can target even these cities into different cities. Right, so you can run national campaigns that target just the cities in which you're focusing on, just the markets you're focusing on, which makes digital much more efficient and targeted than print. And then also you can push a direct path to purchase, right? So in digital content, we can link out to a bunch of different e-commerce sites in which the consumer can learn about the product and purchase at the end, right? Which they say is a benefit to them because they don't have to worry about now, okay, I read about this, okay, now I have to remind myself to go to a store, to go to that store, I have to look up the article again, I have to make the purchase. Purchase immediately, comes to you, whether it's from a site like Drizzly or Minibar, which in our country will deliver within an hour, the product, or it comes from a wine.com, which may take a day or two, the wine is there. And then it's super cost effective. So the industry agrees, right? As these quotes prove, right, content is king, especially custom content. This is why we're seeing a massive shift in the United States to advertising that's focused on what we call custom content. Right? It's not just happening in the alcohol business, it's happening across the board. So if you want to play right now in the United States, if you want to be a marketer that's marketing your product, you have to understand what custom content is. Right? It's the way that publishers are trying to connect their readers to brands. No more will a publisher first sell you a print ad. They will first try to push you down the funnel of custom content. And the reason for that is we can target and we can tell more fleshed out stories, right? It's much more interesting to a consumer to read an actual story about a brand than see an ad of a wine bottle against a castle and wonder where that is or what that's trying to say to them, right? So on average, according to Nielsen, consumers spend almost 2.5 minutes with a branded story, which is about the same as editorial content. That's also why it works, right? So in a traditional print ad, we know that you're flipping through the magazine, you might see a pretty, picture or a celebrity that's endorsing something that you like, and you may then move on to the story. But with custom content, consumers are consuming that content just as they would real editorial, which is very interesting in terms of consumer behavior. And we see that successful content, according to a study that Adweek ran, right, hinges on the ability to target and tailor messages, right? So you're going to be better off running custom content with a publication like ours or other wine and spirits publications than you would be running custom content with Newsweek, right? Because it's going to be a different audience. You're looking at an audience, if you're running custom content with a Vinepair or a Food and Wine, that's already down funnel, right? So they're already an audience that likes to read about food, wine, beer, etc. And so therefore they're going to be more willing to read a story that's an ad about those same things. So what really is sponsored content, right? So sponsored content is customized brand messages, right? So it could be an article, right? It could be a story that we want to tell about your brand. And when you work with us, our entire agency side of our business works with you to come up with what that story is. What are the visual assets that we need? What's the nut graph of the stories, we would say in journalism, right? What's the lead? What's the hook? What's the true story that's going to get someone to really take notice of your brand, right? It could be an infographic, right? So perhaps you are from a new region they haven't heard of before. Perhaps you're a winery in Transylvania, right? And you want to explain what this wine region is. And so you want to do that graphically because infographics are extremely popular among our demographic. It can be a video, right? So it could be a video where we make it in our office with, people who come in and taste your wine. It can also be a video on location in which we film sort of like almost a small little TV show about your brand, right? They can be sweepstakes, social media, tons of different buckets are considered sponsored content. But it's all content that goes back to connecting with the reader in a much more tangible and true way, right? It's actually giving them something that they need, right? So going back really quickly to articles, it may not necessarily be an article about your wine and how great it is, right? If you're a producer in Chianti, it could instead be an article about the great cuisines of that region sponsored by this wine brand, right? And so at the end, it would say something like, look, these recipes brought to you by Ruffino. See, so they're not specifically telling you to connect with them and how great they are. They're instead telling you about their region through their food and then making the connection saying, well, and if you make these recipes, our wine goes great with them, right? So they allow you to be more personal, to try to connect with the reader in a way that you think works, as opposed to hoping that reader makes the connection simply by seeing a print ad. So here's some examples of sponsored content we've run recently. So on the left, you'll see, this is a piece of content we ran recently for a wine in Italy, and the headline is "The Summer White Wine That Shines in Italy's Beautiful Lakes Region." Right, so this was a winery that came to us and basically said, we want to be a popular, it's called Lugano, they wanted to be a popular white in the United States. And we said, well, okay, that's fine, everyone wants to be a popular white in the United States, because you think we drink white wine. What's the real story? So I started talking to them, and what we uncovered was that their wine is drunk more on Lake Garda in the summer than any other white, right? So they're basically the white wine of summer and outdoor water sports, right? This idea that we have in the US of being like the wine of the Hamptons. So that's the story that we told, right? So we basically said, if you want to drink like the Italians in the summer, if you want to have the same kind of cultural experience, then this is the wine you should be drinking. One in the middle is, why aren't you drinking Brut Rosé right now, right? So this is literally a piece of content sponsored by brand saying, you should be drinking bubbly rosé. And we're explaining why, right? And we happen to make one of them, but the whole idea is more of an educational piece about what makes Brut Rosé so interesting. And then the final one was one that we did recently for another brand that's all about food pairings, right? So great foods that pair with their wines. And why did it work? Because as millennials, or as this audience, we want to know use cases for your product. We don't want to just be simply given your wine and then said, okay, you figure it out. Like you go find whatever food you want to eat and get all stressed out about it, right? We like to know, I was just told that this wine is really going to be great with steak, or this wine's perfect for burgers or tacos or Chinese food or Indian food. We want you to tell us how to consume your product, right? Because then we can take that information that we were told and go to our friends and say, you're doing it wrong. Because we like to be experts, right? That's really important among this generation. We like to have knowledge. And so that's why a piece of content like this run by a brand was so effective. You can do cocktail videos like we've done with Bowls and Four Roses. This is an infographic like I was talking about. So this is for the wine region of Rioja. So literally breaking down what their region is in a very easy to understand infographic. Right? So here's where we make the wine. Here are the flavor profiles. Again, things that consumers can actually use. Right? This is a map that works very well as a piece of sponsored content, but may not work as well editorially. Right? But it's a message that the region wanted to get across. They wanted people to understand the different labeling systems on the back labels of their bottles, etc. So we make a really digestible piece of content that consumers can actually understand. So I want to walk you really quickly through a case study of something that we did with a brand in Italy. So this was a brand called Scarbolo. So Scarbolo is a brand, they make Pinot Grigio, and for a while they were really, really successful at it, right? And then they fell on hard times. So they had a lot of weather issues. They then watched Santa Margherita and all these other Pinot Grigios kind of pass them in the US market. And last year they decided that it was time for them to make a push back into the United States. And they were planning on doing, basically we're just another Pinot Grigio. Like that was their strategy, right? We're gonna come into the market and we're basically gonna push in as saying, well, we're a higher quality Pinot Grigio. And what we noticed immediately when talking to our staff was, well, that's actually not your story. Your story is that you make a skin contact Pinot Grigio, right? Which is really unique, right? It's very cool for the consumer, and no one right now is owning that story. Yes, there are lots of actual Pinot Grigio producers that make skin contact Pinot Grigio, but no one's taking that and owning that. So let's tell that story. Let's talk about how making skin contact Pinot Grigio is the OG way of making Pinot Grigio. OG, do we know OG? The authentic way, right? So consumers are looking for authenticity, right? So what we said is we basically played on some of the feelings of the consumer market and said, look, that Santa Margherita that you've been drinking, that's actually not the traditional way that this wine has been made. The way this wine has been made is in the way that Scarborough is making the wine. And so you should check out this wine if you really want to understand the history of the region and the wine in the bottle. And so what we did then is created a fully 360 campaign that took this article that talked about how this was the original way of making Pinot Grigio and spread it across Twitter, Pinterest, Facebook, and email, all with the goal of connecting people back to their wine. Right? They saw an increase in sales. They got great calls from retailers across the country, all because they basically went out to market with a message that they had never considered before, which was that not were they just another Pinot Grigio, but they were the original Pinot Grigio. So the results were 2 times over benchmark in terms of engagement and readership, a massive amount of impressions, and then, as we said, additional sales, which helped the brand, and the brand can now use this article to educate its sales team. So they've used this article to push their sales team in the Los Angeles market and a few other markets to educate them about what makes the wine unique, so that then their salespeople can go and actually talk to the generation they're actually trying to target. So, look, the 2 main takeaways I would talk about with digital and with sponsored content is, first, the way the next generation engages with content has completely changed, right? We want to have a conversation with brands, and old school print advertising doesn't allow for you to have that conversation, right? So as the market is evolving, you should be evolving with it, and you should be thinking as digitally as possible. Whether that's through your advertising models or whether that's through what you're doing as well on your own websites and in your own social, we're all looking to have engaged conversations, and we want to know what's unique and different about you, right? Consumers are highly receptive to sponsored content, and the landscape is always changing. So it's really important that you try to stay as abreast as possible. I would obviously say read Vinepair, but there's also a lot of other really great sites like Digiday in the United States, which talks a lot about digital advertising trends, et cetera, to help you stay informed about how this new consumer is looking to engage with products. Thank you. Any questions?
Any questions? I have one.
Yes.
You were talking about storytelling and so on.
Yeah.
Can you shortly tell us the story of Vinepair? Why you started it, how you started it?
Yeah, totally. So Vinepair started 5 years ago. The goal with the publication was we were a bunch of people who were interested in wines first, and then really in craft beer and spirits. But we didn't like any of the publications that existed. So none of us, when we started talking about what we read, none of us read the current publications. And so we said, well, how can we be this passionate about this world of drinks, and we're not subscribers to the publications that are focused on the world of drinks? And so we had seen what was happening in the United States because we were in media. And so we had seen that this was happening in the world of food with a publication called Eater that was sort of replacing the older school publications. It was happening in travel with a new publication called Afar, which was sort of replacing the Condé Nast Traveler, et cetera. And so we said, why don't we do this in the drink space? And so we started 5 years ago with just myself and my co-founder. And we're a VC-backed startup, so we raised some funding. and then scaled the publication. And so took it from very small to being now the largest in only 5 years. And the reason we've been able to do that is because the way that we come at the industry and our perspective is completely different. So we really try to take a holistic view of the world of wine, beer, and spirits and recognize that you don't sit in a vacuum, right? Wine is a lubricant or an addition or a part of experiences. There is a very small population, I'm saying less than 1% in the United States, that cares about wine in terms of collecting and showing off. It's a very different population. And that was who those other publications were for. But the majority of consumers are interested in wine in terms of the joy that it will bring to a dinner party. Or in terms of, as was talked about earlier with Mel's presentation, going on a trip and taking in a winery. That's why they're interested in wine. They're not interested in wine to fill a cellar. Most of us, which I'm sure is also a trend in Romania and others, have moved back to cities, and we live in small apartments. We don't have massive wine fridges. We're not building cellars. We want the wine to be good now, and we want it to heighten the experience. We don't want it so that we can cellar it and talk about it in 12 years. That's not what's important to us. So that's why we started Vinepair.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm one of your humble subscribers. And I have actually 2 questions.
Okay.
First, if you, Vinepair, would like to promote Romanian wines, what would you do as Vinepair? And which are the steps? And the second question is regarding the different media, because I saw you promote the rosé wine different on Twitter than on Facebook.
Yeah.
And which would be this difference?
Cool. So the first one is with Romanian wine in general, I think the first way we would tackle Romanian wine is from the educational aspect, right? So Italian wine or French wine, when we have clients that come to us, either regions or specific individual wines, there is a knowledge base that the American consumer has of these regions and these wines. It's not that big, but they at least have a little bit of it. It blows my mind that a majority of our consumer doesn't actually know what Super Tuscan is, or doesn't actually know what Brunello is, right? They're still learning. It wasn't knowledge that really got passed down, because remember, only about that 1% I was talking about had that knowledge, and the other problem and why we started Vinepair is they're really protective of that knowledge. So they speak in a language, using terms, et cetera, that this consumer base can't understand, and they won't teach you, right? And we're already a country, embarrassingly, that only speaks one language. Right? We don't put an emphasis on learning Spanish and learning French, et cetera. I mean, you have to take it for 2 or 3 years, then most people forget it, right? The fact that European countries, most people can speak 2 languages is embarrassing to the United States, right? Because we can't. So if we can't be bothered to learn another real language, most of us cannot learn the language of wine. So that's allowed this 1% of the population to have all this power, right? So what we would do first is we would look at educating the consumer when it comes to Romania. First of all, where is it? Right? What kind of wine are you known for? What's the history here? How does it connect back to your overall country story? What are the different regions? We'd probably do that through some articles and some infographics, right? And why, at the end of the day, should you drink it, right? What makes you unique? So earlier I think 2 nights ago, I had the opportunity to sort of chat about this a little bit with Simona. And the idea, right, is first of all, explaining to a consumer, right, our consumer, why Romania, and then especially if you're coming into the market with Sauvignon Blanc, why, right? There's so many places that already produce Sauvignon Blanc. So has Romania been recognized as being one of the greatest places for producing Sauvignon Blanc, right? If so, then you have to leave with that. If not, then come into the market with the indigenous varieties. Because this tells the history, this tells the story of the country, this tells the story of the people, and that's what the market will really respond to. Instead of you coming in, so we would have these conversations with you either as a region or you as a producer, right? These are the things that we think are important in telling your story. And then we would create all these different pieces of content. So, second question, why did it look different? So what's really important to remember about everything digital and print, since we do have a magazine, is every audience is different on every platform. So we have certain people who say that they're a subscriber to our email newsletter, right? And that's how they see all of our articles. And so they get the newsletter, every morning, and they think that that's the morning we publish that content. When actually, some of those articles are from 2 or 3 days ago, and we just didn't have space to put them in the newsletter until that day, right? But that's how they're a reader of Vinepair. There's another audience that comes to vinepair.com every morning. So the homepage markets to them differently. On Facebook, the audience is different, and that's how they experience Vinepair. So the headline might change, the images might change, right? Because our site is, the homepage, right? We do a lot of illustrations. We're very graphically oriented. So we have a really amazing art director, and she does a lot of graphic design and lots of illustrations in order to, produce a much higher end look online. But on Facebook, if you put an article on Facebook that has graphics, no one clicks. People like pictures, photography. So the article image will change. And it will be photography on Facebook. On Twitter, we'll think, again, about what the headline is or what the story is in order to find that audience. So that's why everything looks differently depending on what platform you're on, because every audience is different, right? And it's very little crossover. If you're someone who's consuming on Twitter and that's how you're getting all of your content, you're probably not also consuming our same content on Facebook, for the most part.
So you are looking at the inside of every social media?
Everything. And we're looking at the data of every single platform, right? So how is it performing on this platform? Why is it doing well or why isn't it? And then we adapt. So we use a lot of different programs, some that we've built in-house. So we're a tech company as well. So some of the programs we've built in-house, some of the programs, we work with other tech companies, and we push our data through these channels in order to analyze it in real time and understand what's doing well and why.
And you are using sponsored posts, boost posts?
So when we do client content, so sponsored client content, we will test them, but then everything else is organic. Thank you. Yes.
When you work with brands, do you work differently with small sort of family-owned brands versus large brands? Is there a difference in the way that you interact with them, the way you suggest they display themselves?
That's a good question. I think the smaller brands usually have limited resources, but may have the story that people are really interested in. So, we make different suggestions, but for the most part, we try to work with everyone equally. Like, you don't get the best talent only if you're a large brand and you have a lot of money, compared to if you are a small brand and you don't. So we work within people's budgets when it comes to sponsored content. And we recognize that there are, I think the small brands are easier, right? Because they have a more authentic story to the consumer. But what's actually fun is working with the larger brands and finding that story, right? Because they may not have known that was the story that they had. So it just depends on what they're coming to with us, what the problem is, what KPIs we're trying to solve for. Is it that you want to become one of the top selling rosés in the United States? Or is it that you simply want people to know that you make wine in this small region in France?
Any more questions? I would have one for you.
Cool.
How do you see the future of classic print media on wine, Wine Spectator, Wine Enthusiast, and so on? Where do you see them in, let's say, 10, 20 years?
I think they're going to continue to shrink if they don't change. I do. I think you look at their sales data, their audience isn't growing, it's shrinking. They've locked their content digitally, so you have to pay to get a lot of their content online. And so I think the content's staying out of touch. So I think it will shrink, but we have to think about that as well for us. Right, we have to continue to adapt too, or our audience will, the Gen Z behind us will start their own publication, and it's ever evolving. And I think, it's having a business background, right? Like, it's really easy to be the big cow in the market, but cows are slow, and eventually, if you don't start trying to adapt, you'll hurt. Which is why I think we outgrew them so fast, because they haven't adapted. I think adaptation is key. I think it's just as key for wine. I think Romania is really in an interesting position because you haven't yet told your story, but we talk about a lot in our office is these heritage brands that think they're heritage in the United States because Spectator and Enthusiast wrote and Decanter wrote about them, and our audience has no clue who they are. And I'm talking wines like Ornellaia and Sassicaia, big wines that our audience have never drank, do not know. And they are not spending to reach this audience. They are not trying to talk to this audience. And I think they also will have a huge problem because it's really easy to be still selling wines now, but that audience will change. And you will then not be the audience they think about because they found other wines to be obsessed with. So everyone has to continue to adapt. Yeah.
I understand you're having an art director, you're probably doing copy in-house. Why and how does it make sense to keep everything in-house rather than externalize it?
So we have freelancers too. Tons of what we would call stringers around the world that, pitch our editor-in-chief and will write stories for us. But what's really important about having an in-house art director, design team, editorial team, et cetera, is our voice is very important to us. And so publishing stories in our voice that are authentic to us means that we have to have every piece of content, even content that comes in from a freelancer, ultimately edited to our voice. Or else you would read it and say, oh, this doesn't feel like a Vinepair article. And we don't want that to happen. You're welcome.
Any more questions? I have one.
Cool.
Last one from my side. Is there any critical comments that you have sponsored content? Because very often people want independent stuff and so on.
No, I think you get criticism and it's people are adapting. We knew that this was going to be part of our business model when we started, but you have to clearly label it. If you clearly say it's sponsored, if you say it's advertiser-supported content, no one has a problem with it. It's when you hide it, right? It's when you write an article that clearly seems like a brand paid for it, or when you're an influencer or a blogger that goes on a wine trip and you post a ton of photos, but you never say that it was a trip you were sent on, et cetera. That's when people seem to really do have a problem, and they should. And the FCC, which is our regulatory body in the United States for media, has cracked down on this quite a bit. You can now report publications that you think are doing paid for content but aren't labeling it as such. But when it's labeled, no one really has a problem with it. You know what you're getting into. You label it very clearly on social. You label it very clearly when someone reads it. You're reading an ad. And if you're still getting great information from it, they will enjoy it. That's why there's a lot of skill to making great sponsored content, because it needs to be as good or better than the editorial product, which is why we don't just take what a brand tells us they want to say. We say, look, you need to come and talk to our editorial team, and we need to have an influence on what actually is going to be written here, so that it isn't just, oh, great, like a brand is publishing their 5-generation history. No one wants to read that, right? So we look for the stronger story, and then tell that story instead.
You talked about digital and success stories. Would you share a story that was not really successful? I mean, what happened, like a story, when it fails?
You mean in terms of an advertiser?
Didn't work, yeah. Digital didn't work. Why, or what the client said and stuff like that.
I mean, we have an 85% client retention rate, so we haven't really had. I will say we've never had a true failure. I mean, Liz can correct me if I'm wrong, but we've had clients that we fought with more than others, right? That can be a failure in of itself, wasted time, right? People for whom I'm saying the example I gave in which they have a story they really want to tell, and they don't understand that that's a story that unfortunately the market does not care about, right? And I think that happens a lot when you get family-owned wineries, right? Because it's this is a story that's very important to the family, right? Of how, a grandparent passed it down to a current parent passing it down to a child. But what people don't realize is that that's a very common story, especially in Europe, right? Not really in America, but especially in Europe. And the market has heard that story over and over and over again. And so we've had some instances with people like that. Or when you might have a client that comes to you who already has a promotion running, right, that we know is not going to resonate with our demographic, but they're running it nationally because, I don't know, their advertising agency convinced them of it. And we have to say, like, look, if you want to run with us, this isn't the messaging we want to go with because our audience doesn't care about X, Y, or Z promotion you're already running. Maybe it's, I don't know, sponsoring Formula One or something, and maybe our audience doesn't care. That's a bad, just an off-the-cuff example, but that could be something where it's like, what would we do? We're an audience that comes to read about, you know, culture, travel, food, etc. What kind of content would we do if you're a Formula One sponsor? That kind of stuff. Yeah.
How do you track listeners to your podcast? Is it only through the website?
No, so listeners, we use a few services. So we're on Anchor, then we use Chartable, and we pull that data down from iTunes, because iTunes is very opaque, right? So these different tech services hit iTunes and SoundCloud and, you know, Spotify, and then will show us the actual downloads per episode that we can then report back.
Cool. Anyone? Question? Because in Romania there doesn't really exist classical wine media printed. There's Vinul.ro, which is printed but mostly online. Cezar, back there. But there is no classical. Everything is new. Everything is digital. What would be your recommendation? What to follow? What to do to become as successful as you are?
I think the biggest thing is listening to your audience. So if it's digital, I would assume it's probably a younger audience, but maybe not. But listening to them and understanding what kinds of things they're looking for. So what are the articles they want to read? You know, what are the conversations that people are having, and how do those conversations tie into a larger conversation that the country is currently having, right? So we run lots of articles that are related to social and political issues that the United States is going through right now, because wine, beer, spirits are inherently political. And so we realize that you can't separate that from simply a nice article about how this Pinot Noir has notes of strawberries and, you know, is grown in this idyllic place in Oregon. Like, there's some real stories that we want to talk about. So it's thinking about those and trying to be relevant in a larger conversation than just a conversation about the tasting notes of the beverages, et cetera.
Then, if there are no more questions, I say thank you very much.
Thank you.
We learned all a lot, and thanks for coming.
Thank you.